The sanctuary falls silent as Pastor Mike Henderson steps up to the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he grips the edges of the wooden lectern. For 37 years, he's delivered sermons to this congregation in small-town Georgia. But today, half the pews sit empty. The other half are filled with faces that no longer look at him with the same reverence they once did. 3 weeks ago, Pastor Henderson made what he thought was an innocuous comment about loving your neighbor regardless of their political beliefs. 3 weeks ago, his church began to tear itself apart. What Pastor Henderson didn't realize was that he had just become another casualty in the most divisive conflict to hit American Christianity in generations. A political civil war that's splitting evangelical churches down the middle, destroying decades-old friendships, fracturing families, and forcing pastors across the nation to choose between their pulpits and their principles. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, Reverend Sarah Williams received death threats after she refused to hang campaign flags in her church. In Phoenix, Arizona, Trinity Baptist Church split into two separate congregations after a fistfight broke out during a board meeting about vaccine mandates. In rural Kentucky, the Riverside Community Church lost 60% of its members in a single month when their pastor suggested that Christians could disagree on political issues while still sharing the same faith. These aren't isolated incidents. They're symptoms of a phenomenon that's reshaping the landscape of American Christianity in ways that would have been unthinkable just 2 decades ago. Across the United States, evangelical churches, institutions that once prided themselves on unity under Christ, are experiencing an unprecedented level of political polarization that's forcing congregants to choose between their political identity and their spiritual community. The numbers tell a stark story. According to the Pew Research Center, white evangelical Protestants have become the most politically homogeneous religious group in America, with over 78% identifying as Republican or Republican-leaning. But within that seemingly unified bloc, fault lines are appearing. A 2023 study by the Public Religion Research Institute found that 26% of white evangelicals under the age of 30 consider themselves political independents compared to just 8% of their parents' generation. But how did we get here? How did the Prince of Peace become a partisan talking point? How did churches that once preached about turning the other cheek become battlegrounds for political warfare? To understand the current crisis, we need to go back to 1976, a year that would fundamentally alter the relationship between evangelical Christianity and American politics. That year, a born-again Christian peanut farmer from Georgia named Jimmy Carter was elected President of the United States. For the first time in modern American history, an evangelical was sitting in the Oval Office. But Carter's presidency would prove to be a double-edged sword for the evangelical movement. While his faith brought evangelicals into the political spotlight, his progressive positions on issues like racial integration and women's rights created tension within the community. More importantly, Carter's presidency coincided with a broader cultural shift that many evangelicals saw as an attack on their values. The real catalyst came in 1978, when the Internal Revenue Service attempted to revoke the tax-exempt status of racially discriminatory Christian schools. This move galvanized evangelical leaders like Jerry Falwell Sr., who saw it as government overreach into religious affairs. The following year, Falwell founded the Moral Majority, an organization that would become the template for evangelical political engagement for the next 4 decades. Paul Weyrich, one of the Moral Majority's co-founders, was remarkably candid about their strategy. In a 1990 interview, he explained, "We were looking for an issue that would be broad enough to get evangelicals involved in politics, but specific enough that they would feel their faith was under attack." The abortion issue, which had been largely ignored by evangelicals before the late 1970s, became that rallying cry. What followed was a systematic campaign to merge evangelical identity with conservative political ideology. Organizations like Focus on the Family, the Family Research Council, and the Christian Coalition spent millions of dollars creating what sociologist Samuel Perry calls Christian nationalism. The belief that America was founded as a Christian nation and that true Christianity requires specific political positions. The strategy was wildly successful. By the 1980s, white evangelicals had become the most reliable voting bloc in the Republican Party. But this political awakening came with an unexpected cost. It began to change the nature of evangelical worship itself. Dr. Kristen Kobies-Dumez, author of Jesus and John Wayne, spent 5 years studying how evangelical culture evolved during this period. Her research revealed a disturbing trend. Evangelical churches were slowly but surely replacing biblical teachings with political talking points. "I visited churches where the American flag was larger than the cross," Dumez explains. "I heard sermons where Jesus was portrayed as a warrior who would support military action in the Middle East. The transformation was subtle but profound." By the 2000s, many evangelical churches had developed what theologians call civil religion, a fusion of Christianity and American nationalism that made political dissent within the congregation virtually impossible. Church members who questioned conservative political positions found themselves labeled as spiritually immature or worse, as false Christians. The 2016 election marked a turning point in this evolution. For the first time, a significant number of evangelicals began to question whether their churches had become too politicized. The support of 81% of white evangelicals for Donald Trump, a candidate whose personal life seemed to contradict many traditional Christian values, created what sociologist Ryan Burge calls cognitive dissonance within the community. Pastor David Gushee, a prominent evangelical theologian, remembers the moment he realized how deep the political divisions had become. During a 2017 sermon about refugees and immigrants, a longtime church member stood up in the middle of his message and shouted, "That's not what Jesus would say." The congregation erupted in arguments that continued long after the service ended. 6 months later, Gushee's church had lost nearly 40% of its members. "It was devastating," Gushee recalls. "These were people I had known for decades. I had performed their children's weddings, comforted them during family tragedies, celebrated their joys. But when I suggested that Jesus' teachings about loving the stranger might apply to modern immigration policy, I became their enemy." Hey everyone, welcome to Professor Archive, where we dive deep into the stories that shape our world. Before we continue with this fascinating exploration of how politics has transformed American evangelical churches, I'd love to know, where are you watching from today? Drop your location and what time it is where you are in the comments below. Are you a teacher, a student, someone in ministry, or just someone curious about history? I always love hearing from our diverse community of viewers. The divisions that began in individual churches soon spread to entire denominations. The Southern Baptist Convention, America's largest Protestant denomination with over 14 million members, has been particularly affected. Once unified around conservative theology and biblical authority, the SBC now faces what many observers describe as an internal civil war. The conflict came to a head during the 2021 Southern Baptist Convention annual meeting in Nashville. For the first time in the organization's 176-year history, the convention was forced to address accusations of sexual abuse cover-ups, racial reconciliation, and critical race theory, issues that split along predictable political lines. The meeting was so contentious that security had to be called to restore order on multiple occasions. Russell Moore, who served as the president of the SBC's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission from 2013 to 2021, became a lightning rod for criticism when he criticized Trump's character and called for churches to address racial injustice. The backlash was swift and brutal. Moore received death threats, had his funding cut by angry churches, and was eventually forced to resign his position. I realized that many people in our churches had become more committed to political party than to the gospel, Moore reflected in a 2021 interview. When I spoke about sexual abuse in churches, they said I was being political. When I quoted Jesus about loving your enemies, they said I was being divisive. It became clear that the gospel itself had become controversial in our own churches. But Moore wasn't alone. Across the country, moderate evangelical pastors found themselves caught between their biblical convictions and the political expectations of their congregations. A 2022 survey by the Hartford Institute for Religion Research found that 38% of evangelical pastors had considered leaving the ministry due to political pressure from their congregations. Pastor John Williams of Grace Community Church in Tennessee never thought he would become controversial. For 15 years, he had preached traditional evangelical theology without incident. But in March 2020, when he suggested that wearing masks during the pandemic was a way to love your neighbor, everything changed. I received over 300 angry emails in 1 week, Williams recalls. People were saying I was promoting fear over faith, that I was buying into liberal propaganda. One family that had been in our church for 20 years told me I was no longer their pastor because I had chosen politics over God. Williams pauses, his voice heavy with emotion. The irony was that they were the ones making it political. I was just trying to keep people safe. The pandemic accelerated existing divisions within evangelical churches in ways that surprised even seasoned observers. Suddenly, decisions about mask mandates, vaccine requirements, and online services became litmus tests for political loyalty. Churches that had navigated theological disputes for decades found themselves unable to agree on basic public health measures. Dr. Amanda Tyler, executive director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, has spent her career studying church-state relations. But even she was unprepared for the level of political toxicity that emerged during the pandemic. I started receiving calls from pastors who were afraid to preach certain Bible verses because they might be seen as too political, Tyler explains. One pastor told me he couldn't preach the Sermon on the Mount because his congregation would think he was promoting socialism. Another said he avoided the book of James because it talks too much about helping the poor. When the Bible itself becomes controversial in Christian churches, you know something has gone seriously wrong. The statistics bear out these anecdotal reports. According to Lifeway Research, 42% of evangelical pastors say they have avoided preaching on certain Bible passages because they might be misinterpreted as political statements. 56% report that their congregations have become more politically divided in the past 5 years. But perhaps nowhere is the political civil war more visible than in the seminary classroom. At institutions that train future evangelical pastors, professors are grappling with students who arrive with deeply entrenched political views that often conflict with traditional Christian theology. Professor Michael Bird, who teaches New Testament at Ridley College in Australia, but frequently lectures at American evangelical seminaries, describes a troubling trend. I've had students tell me that they can't accept certain teachings of Jesus because they conflict with their political beliefs. When I taught about Jesus' radical inclusivity, students would argue that I was promoting liberal ideology. When I discussed Jesus' teachings about wealth and poverty, they would accuse me of being anti-capitalist. It's as if they want a Jesus who confirms their political positions rather than challenges them. The impact on seminary education has been profound. Several prominent evangelical seminaries have reported significant drops in enrollment, particularly among younger students who are increasingly skeptical of institutions they see as too political. Fuller Theological Seminary, once the flagship of evangelical education, has lost nearly 40% of its students since 2018. Meanwhile, a new generation of evangelical leaders is emerging with a very different vision for the church's role in society. These younger evangelicals, many of whom identify as politically progressive or independent, are starting their own churches, publishing houses, and advocacy organizations. Reverend Seung-Chan Ra, professor of church growth and evangelism at North Park Theological Seminary, represents this new generation. We're seeing a reformation within evangelicalism, Ra explains. Young evangelicals are tired of being told that their faith requires them to support specific political candidates or policies. They want a Christianity that looks more like Jesus, one that cares for the poor, welcomes the stranger, and seeks justice for the oppressed. This generational divide is creating unprecedented tensions within evangelical families. Dr. Elizabeth Newman, former Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security under Trump and an evangelical herself, has studied how political polarization affects religious families. Her research reveals that family dynamics within evangelical households have become increasingly strained. I've interviewed families where parents and adult children no longer speak because they disagree about politics, Neumann reports. These aren't casual political differences. They're fundamental disagreements about what it means to be a Christian in America today. I've seen marriages end, siblings become estranged, and lifelong friendships destroyed. The cost of this political polarization goes far beyond the church walls. The data supports Neumann's observations. A 2023 survey by the American Enterprise Institute found that 28% of white evangelical families report that politics has damaged their relationships with family members. Among evangelicals under 30, that number rises to 37%. But the most tragic casualties of this political civil war may be the churches themselves. Across the country, congregations that once served as pillars of their communities are closing their doors or splitting into fragments too small to sustain meaningful ministry. The story of First Baptist Church of Riverside is typical of what's happening in thousands of communities. Founded in 1952, the church had grown to over 800 members by 2015. It operated a food bank, a homeless shelter, and a preschool. The congregation was diverse by evangelical standards, including both longtime residents and newer arrivals to the growing suburb. The divisions began slowly. During the 2016 election, some members began wearing political buttons to church services. Others objected, leading to heated arguments in the parking lot after worship. By 2018, the church board was spending more time discussing political issues than ministry programs. The breaking point came in 2020 when Pastor Robert Chen preached a sermon series on racial reconciliation following the death of George Floyd. Chen, who is Asian American, shared his own experiences with racism and called on the congregation to examine their hearts and their community. The reaction was swift and brutal. 40 families left the church immediately. Others demanded Chen's resignation. Board meetings became shouting matches. Within 6 months, attendance had dropped from 400 to fewer than 150. We went from being a thriving church family to being a collection of angry strangers, recalls longtime member Margaret Thompson. People who had been friends for decades stopped speaking to each other. Children who had grown up together were forbidden from playing together because their parents disagreed about politics. It was heartbreaking. In 2022, First Baptist Church of Riverside voted to dissolve. The building was sold to a developer who turned it into condominiums. The food bank closed. The homeless shelter was shuttered. The preschool found a new location, but many families had already left the community. We lost more than a church, Thompson reflects. We lost the heart of our community. And for what? Because we couldn't agree on politics? It seems so foolish now, but at the time, those political differences felt like life and death issues. The Riverside story is being repeated across the country. The Hartford Institute for Religion Research estimates that over 4,000 Protestant churches closed permanently between 2019 and 2023, with political divisions cited as a contributing factor in approximately 60% of those closures. But even churches that haven't closed are struggling with the aftermath of political division. Many congregations have implemented unofficial policies to avoid political topics entirely, leading to what sociologists call the sacred-secular divide, an artificial separation between faith and real-world issues that leaves many Christians feeling spiritually unfulfilled. Pastor Maria Santos of New Life Community Church in California has tried to navigate this divide by focusing exclusively on what she calls safe biblical topics: personal salvation, prayer, and individual morality. But even this approach has proven problematic. I thought I could keep politics out of the church by avoiding controversial topics, Santos explains. But I discovered that in today's climate, everything is political. When I preached about loving your enemies, people assumed I was talking about political opponents. When I discussed caring for creation, they thought I was promoting environmental activism. When I mentioned helping refugees, they heard immigration policy. It became impossible to preach the gospel without someone interpreting it through a political lens. The consequences of this political saturation extend far beyond individual churches. Evangelical Christianity, which once held significant moral authority in American society, has seen its public credibility severely damaged by its association with partisan politics. A 2023 Gallup poll found that only 34% of Americans have confidence in organized religion, down from 68% in 1975. Among Americans under 30, that number drops to just 18%. Perhaps most troubling for evangelical leaders, 41% of Americans now view evangelical Christianity as primarily a political movement rather than a religious one. Dr. John Fea, a historian at Messiah University and author of Believe Me, The Evangelical Road to Donald Trump, has studied how this transformation occurred. His research reveals that the politicization of evangelical Christianity was neither accidental nor inevitable. Beginning in the late 1970s, evangelical leaders made a deliberate choice to tie their religious identity to partisan politics. Fea explains. They believed they could use political power to advance their religious agenda. But what actually happened was the reverse. Politics began to shape their religious agenda. Over time, many evangelicals became more committed to their political identity than to their religious one. The results of this transformation are now visible across multiple generations. Young people who grew up in evangelical churches are leaving in unprecedented numbers, often citing the church's political involvement as a primary reason for their departure. 24-year-old Sarah Mitchell grew up in a prominent evangelical family in Texas. Her father was a deacon, her mother led the women's ministry, and Sarah herself was active in youth group throughout high school. But during college, she began to question the relationship between her faith and her church's political positions. I realized that my church was more concerned with supporting Republican candidates than with following Jesus, Mitchell explains. When I raised questions about caring for the poor or welcoming immigrants, I was told I was being deceived by liberal professors. When I suggested that Jesus might have something to say about gun violence or healthcare, I was accused of letting politics corrupt my faith. The irony was that they were the ones who had confused politics with faith. Mitchell's story is increasingly common. The Barna Group reports that 59% of millennials who grew up in evangelical churches have dropped out at some point, with 38% citing political issues as a major factor in their decision. But some young evangelicals are choosing a different path. Instead of leaving the faith entirely, they're working to reclaim what they see as authentic Christianity from its political captors. Organizations like Sojourners, the Evangelical Environmental Network, and Red Letter Christians are growing rapidly among younger evangelicals who want to maintain their faith while rejecting its political packaging. Josh Butler, a millennial pastor in Portland, Oregon, represents this emerging movement. His church, Redemption Church, attracts primarily young families who identify as evangelical, but reject the political conservatism traditionally associated with that label. We're trying to get back to the basics of following Jesus, Butler explains. That means caring for the poor, seeking justice for the oppressed, and building beloved community across racial and political lines. We're evangelical in the truest sense. We believe in the gospel of Jesus Christ. But we reject the idea that the gospel requires any particular political position. Butler's approach isn't without controversy. He's received criticism from both traditional evangelicals, who see him as too liberal, and from progressive Christians, who question whether the evangelical label can be redeemed. But his church continues to grow, suggesting that there may be a hunger for non-political evangelical Christianity that established denominations have failed to recognize. The question facing evangelical Christianity today is whether this kind of reformation is possible on a larger scale. Can a religious movement that has become so thoroughly politicized rediscover its spiritual center? Can churches that have been torn apart by political division find a way to heal? Some scholars are optimistic. Dr. Jamar Tisby, author of The Color of Compromise, believes that the current crisis may ultimately strengthen evangelical Christianity by forcing it to confront its own contradictions. Sometimes things have to get worse before they get better, Tisby argues. The political capture of evangelical Christianity has exposed problems that were always there but were hidden beneath the surface. The racism, the nationalism, the comfort with worldly power. These weren't new developments. They were always part of white evangelical culture. But now that they're visible, they can be addressed. Other observers are less sanguine. Dr. Samuel Perry, co-author of Taking America Back for God, warns that the merger of Christian and political identity may be too complete to reverse. We're dealing with a phenomenon that goes beyond mere political preference, Perry explains. For many evangelicals, conservative politics has become a core part of their religious identity. Challenging their political beliefs feels like challenging their faith itself. That's a much harder problem to solve than simple political disagreement. The path forward remains unclear. Some churches are experimenting with what they call political fasting, deliberately avoiding political topics for extended periods to focus on spiritual formation. Others are embracing what they call prophetic politics, addressing political issues but from a distinctly Christian perspective that doesn't align neatly with either major political party. Meanwhile, a growing number of evangelicals are simply walking away from organized religion altogether, choosing to practice their faith in small house churches or informal gatherings that avoid institutional politics entirely. As we've seen throughout this exploration, the political civil war splitting evangelical churches isn't just about politics. It's about the very nature of Christian identity in America. It's about whether faith can transcend partisan division, whether religious communities can maintain unity across political differences, and whether the gospel of Jesus Christ can speak to contemporary issues without becoming captive to contemporary politics. The stakes couldn't be higher. At a time when American society desperately needs moral leadership and community healing, the institutions that have traditionally provided those resources are fragmenting under the weight of their own political divisions. Pastor Mike Henderson, whom we met at the beginning of our story, made a decision that Sunday morning 3 weeks after his congregation began to splinter. Instead of avoiding controversial topics or doubling down on political positions, he chose a different path. He preached about forgiveness. I told our congregation that I had failed them, Henderson recalls. I had allowed politics to become more important than people, ideology to become more important than love. I asked for their forgiveness, and I committed to leading our church back to the basics of following Jesus. The response was mixed. Some families who had left returned, grateful for Henderson's humility and leadership. Others remained skeptical, unwilling to risk further disappointment. A few families left permanently, convinced that Henderson had compromised his principles by refusing to take clear political stands. But something unexpected happened in the months that followed. The church began to grow again, attracting people who had been hurt by political divisions in other congregations. Young families started attending, drawn by the possibility of raising their children in a faith community that prioritized spiritual formation over political conformity. We're not the same church we were before, Henderson reflects. We're smaller, younger, more diverse, but we're also more focused on what really matters: loving God and loving our neighbors. The political divisions haven't completely disappeared, but they're no longer the most important thing about us. Henderson's experience offers a glimpse of what might be possible if evangelical churches can find the courage to prioritize their religious mission over their political identity. But it also illustrates how difficult and costly such transformation can be. The political civil war in evangelical churches is far from over. Across the country, congregations continue to split, pastors continue to resign, and families continue to fracture along political lines. The movement that once prided itself on unity under Christ remains deeply divided by earthly political concerns. But perhaps within this crisis lies an opportunity. Perhaps the current divisions will force evangelical Christianity to rediscover its prophetic voice, one that speaks truth to power regardless of which party holds it, one that comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable, one that seeks first the kingdom of God rather than the kingdoms of this world. The future of evangelical Christianity in America may well depend on whether its leaders and members can remember that their first allegiance is not to any political party or ideology, but to the radical, boundary-crossing, status quo-challenging gospel of Jesus Christ. Only time will tell whether the churches can heal the divisions that threaten to destroy them from within. But one thing is certain: the outcome of this civil war will shape not only the future of American Christianity, but the moral and spiritual fabric of American society for generations to come. Before we wrap up today's deep dive into this crucial topic, I want to thank you for sticking with us through this complex and sometimes heartbreaking story. If you found this exploration valuable and want to support the work we do here at Professor Archive, consider leaving a super thanks. It really helps us continue producing these in-depth historical documentaries. And don't forget to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what your thoughts are on this ongoing crisis in American Christianity. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep seeking the truth behind the headlines.